Let me click back. There we go. All right. Okay, yeah. So I guess we'll pick up. Apologies for the audio. Just figured out what the heck was going on. I had it muted in the deal, so everybody should be able to hear us now. Okay. So once again, we have John Burns with us, former Wake County Commissioner. John, give us a rundown again. Sorry,
All right.
technical difficulties.
Like I said, more importantly for your audience, I'm Laura's brother. Learned everything I know from her about going viral and being controversial online.
I'm flattered.
And served one term as a county commissioner where we focused on making sure that Wake County was ready for the growth that is coming and is here. Improving the schools, making sure that we had a transportation system that was going to be funded for the next 10 years, transit system, and some other issues related to green technology and our building standards, things like that I worked on. And served one term, thought I did a good job. And now I'm back to practicing law because a few people disagreed with me, but here I am. Good.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here tonight. And so, yeah, like I had stated before, whenever the audio was bad, the main reason why I had you on tonight was because of the article that you wrote back in 2016, and you were basically commenting on some of the incendiary remarks that Trump was making at that time period. What was your? I mean, like, why did you feel like you had to say something? Why do there's a lot of people who don't say anything, especially around that time.
Right.
There's a lot of people who just took a back seat. What made you want to say something?
Well, I was a commissioner at the time, and I tend to think that it's part of our responsibility if you're in public office to comment on issues of public concern. And at the time, the president was being a lot kinder to a white supremacist murderer who drove a car into a crowd in Charlottesville than he was to Colin Kaepernick, using much more incendiary language against Kaepernick than he was against that guy whose name I won't repeat in Charlottesville. So I pointed out that if you're more inclined to support that guy over Colin Kaepernick, you're probably a white supremacist. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And I think his actions, particularly in the last month or so, have really shown that to be correct. His comments about the squad, I don't agree with them entirely politically, but his comments are entirely out of line and indicative of a white supremacist, white nationalist mindset. He uses code language all the time, directed at the very people that we were talking about earlier before we went online. So somebody needs to call that out. And if that's a white public official from a southern town, I think that maybe have given me even a little more credibility to call that out. So
I appreciate
not credibility, responsibility to call that out.
I appreciate you having that position. We often talk about identity politics, specifically on the left, and how identity politics has gotten so bad that people can't talk about anything anymore. That's one of the criticisms by people who are on the right, and even some people in the middle. But at the same time, too, our differences, in my opinion, is our differences, end up being our strengths. Because if I'm trying to engage or speak to someone, and speak truth to power, who doesn't have the same background as me, because of how we've been conditioned in the society, it's very, very difficult sometimes to penetrate that barrier that is automatically erected because an individual has seen my complexion or whatever. So right. I do give you kudos for standing up and speaking out, because if I say something and I say, well, oftentimes people of color will say, yeah, Trump is a racist, then people who often are bigoted in their views end up saying, of course you'll say that because you're a black person, and black people think all white people are racist or whatever. Even if you have a logical valid perspective, it's dismissed because of how we're conditioned in this society. And I think that's what feeds into our issues in regard to national security and who we are willing to listen to versus who we dismiss because of that programming in our culture.
I think it also goes into who we see as a threat, because if you're going to talk about terrorism and threats to national security, brown terrorists get a lot more attention than white terrorists do in our society, and I think that's something we got to at least consider. and as a public official, we have a major terrorist target about 15 miles away in the Sharon Harris nuclear plant. And there's all kinds of plans and things that are already laid out in binders and books, some of which I got to read, but not all of which talk about what do we do in the event of a terrorist attack on that facility? What do we do in the event of an accident at that facility? And I think that perhaps people are much more likely to think of being at risk of an Islamic terror attack when really, I think the FBI will back this up. The most likely attack comes from a lone wolf white terrorist, white actor. And I don't think we think about that enough.
Yeah, it's a huge blind spot. Lee, what are your takes?
Well, coming from the military's perspective, we've been at war not in white countries, but we've been in the Middle East. We've been all over Africa in named and unnamed operations since predating 9/11.
Sure.
And the whole purpose of terrorism as, the global war on terrorism, the Cold War, it was over when the Soviet Union collapsed. Terrorism isn't going to collapse. It can't be completely defeated. The only way to completely defeat it would literally be to ethnically cleanse the globe, which is never going to happen. So we've replaced our, it holds different objectives. It keeps the military industrial complex active because we have to have the military and the R&D to support the best military so we can meet this threat. But it also gives the fascist administration a clear target and a way to separate groups and dehumanize them so it can justify the crimes against humanity that it's committing and planning to commit.
And you made a really good point in regard to the inability to cleanse the world ethnically. The whole focus in regard to terrorism in general is terrorism is a relative thing. To Iran, America is full of terrorists. To us, Iran, is full of terrorists based off of whoever's rhetoric you're listening to at any given point in time. And so using, this nebulous concept that is terrorism, fuels this divide when it comes to race. You can, just like, with fascism, arbitrarily labeling people, basically just giving them this blanket title, creates a lightning rod that for hate. Individuals look at these sections of our society and say, those are terrorists, those are undesirables, those are rats, those need to be exterminated, those are vermin, and this language ends up creating this. Ends up creating a feeling of conflict. It ends up creating this idea where we objectify individuals. We stop looking at them as individuals. We start looking at them as groups that are ripe for persecution. Whenever basically Jews were being killed in World War II Germany, it didn't start out with Hitler just setting up death camps and marching people in there. It started out with the rhetoric. It started out with the labeling. It started out with calling people vermin, calling people basically burdens on society, dismissing the fact that they're individuals, and attacking them in these groups. Laura, what are some of your thoughts?
I actually wanted to comment on what you said earlier about when John, I call him Johnny, made the comment about Trump being a white supremacist and how it sort of makes people pay more mind to it when it comes from when you have a white person saying that another white person is racist. It is heard louder than when you have a colored person saying that somebody is racist, and that goes for any demographic or any marginalized group. Like even me being gay, the people that stand up for gay people who are not gay I hear their messages louder, and it means more to me because they have nothing to gain from standing up for that. It's just them being a great person.
True. The fact that we're able to align ourselves, behind our humanity over our titles,
Right.
is one of the biggest strengths that helps us in regard to advancing our message, in regard to letting other people know that this isn't right. It's not just right. It's not right. Along the lines of whatever the cultural divide is. It's not right because it's inhumane. It's not
Right.
acceptable because it perpetuates ideas that lead to persecution, that lead to genocidal practices, and then institutionalized persecution of individuals. And that's what I wanted to talk about in regard to racism being this national security risk. Because just like John talked about, you create this. It's not just about giving preference to groups of individuals that you find an alignment with. It's about creating blind spots because, if I am, a diehard racist and I see, this terrorist who has my same complexion, and he's going to that power plant and I know he doesn't belong there, I'm not going to be as suspicious about that as I would if I saw somebody, of, a brown complexion, heading in that direction. And so your vigilance level is different. In regard to what you're aware of. Same thing in regard, I had this conversation all the time in regard to gun control. Where individuals have stated everybody should have guns. If everybody has guns, then we won't have any issues because everybody's going to be afraid to use a gun. But the fact is, more guns doesn't. It's not going to negate me if I have a death wish. If I decide I want to kill as many people as I want to before I get taken off this planet. The fact that everybody has guns is going to be irrelevant. I may be a little bit more strategic in how I utilize my weaponry, but it's not going to stop me from doing that.
Right.
But I digress. Go ahead.
I circulated a link. I hope you'll post from the headline is the FBI warns that conspiracy theories are the new domestic terrorism threat. There's another one that says there's been over 150 attacks, I think, in the last 7 years around the country that are related specifically to either white supremacists or anti-government activists. And those are two different groups because there are people of color and the anti-government activists. And the white supremacists clearly are they sometimes interact, but they are definitely both not what we are conditioned by the media to believe are the primary terrorist threat, when in fact there's 150 attacks that they've documented, which vary from everything from the shootings at the church in Charleston to the attack in Charlottesville to sometimes it's taken out a couple of cops in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, because you have an anti-government mindset and you express it in what you say before you commit the crime. Those are real attacks. Those are terrorist attacks that are designed to accomplish something politically. And even the FBI says we should be looking at these folks more than we currently are. That's been de-emphasized under this administration, another decision that I disagree with. And I wonder what we're opening ourselves to and what happens. And incidentally, these types of attacks have spiked when the Democrats have won the presidency. It happened under Bill Clinton when the Murrah Federal Building was destroyed by Timothy McVeigh, who clearly fits both these profiles. Mm-hmm. And then it happened again under Obama, where different attacks were happening because of the unpopularity of the African-American president. So I mean, we are clearly, this is going on sort of below the surface for most of us. We don't see it. But it is something that we need to pay attention to.
Agreed. And yeah, I mean, that's one of the biggest issues is this blind spot has been created in our society. Whenever Trump came in the office, I mean, there was an article, and I'll post it too. I have to find a link, but I'll post it in the comments after the fact. Basically, the FBI was investigating the infiltration of law enforcement by white supremacists. And one of the first things that Trump did whenever he came in the office was he shut down those investigations. He withdrew, funding for those investigations.
Right. That's what I was talking about.
Left us unprotected.
Yep.
To add on to what you were saying about, Hitler's Germany, before we got to the death camps, before we even got to rounding anybody up to put them in ghettos, there were individuals being harassed, businesses being vandalized. It wasn't Hitler and his political party storming the streets and doing this. They created an environment that encouraged this by regular citizens of Germany, exactly with the inflammatory rhetoric and singling people out as enemies.
Right. There's a concept called stochastic terror,
Exactly.
where you say things that you know will result in violence. You can't predict where the violence is going to be. You can't predict who the victim will be, but you know it's going to happen. And certain language, particularly incendiary rhetoric from people in power, can cause that. That's what caused the genocide in Rwanda, was people in power and radio stations making these broad statements. You need to kill the Hutus. They didn't necessarily know that one guy would go to his neighbor's house and kill his neighbors, but they knew that they would be generating violence. And that's exactly, not to that extent yet, but it's certainly the types of things we saw with the guy who was in the van with the Trump stickers all over it, who sent mail bombs to prominent Democratic politicians across the country, or the guy who attacked the synagogue in Pittsburgh, were all reacting to things they were hearing, things they were being told. And I think that's really what worries me, is that type of scenario. The lone wolf you can't predict, but you know the concept will happen.
I agree. That's what you are seeing, is an emboldened element of our society, which is hearing this subtext in his in Trump's speeches and the speeches of other white supremacists who have linked themselves to Trump. David Duke basically stating that Trump basically speaks what is on his mind, and these people are emboldened to become, martyrs, to become players, in this larger game where they are trying to perpetuate this divide by any means necessary, by triggering individuals to, react in kind, like they intend to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. As more of these incidences and attacks happen, even if they're unsuccessful, it's going to encourage others who are teetering on whether or not to go through with their plans to go ahead and go through with it. It's kind of like mob mentality. It's a recognized and researched situation where people in a mob, once they're agitated to a certain point, as soon as one person throws a rock through a window, it's on. They've lost control almost of their individual self, and they will go along with the mob. We've actually seen that in protests. Law enforcement infiltrators have put undercover agents and tried to instigate mob violence surrounding the riots nationwide and from the Ferguson situation. So we're seeing that as a kind of dispersed across the nation, where these people are going to become more emboldened. Each time a vocal voice, a celebrity or politician says something, pushes the boundary a little bit further. Someone else is like, oh, well, he's doing it, I can do it too. And, that leads to that kind of one-upmanship also.
And one thing that was uncovered in regard to the Mueller investigation, and this was announced, way at the beginning of the investigation, whenever Russian meddling was, first established via social media, was the exploitation of these divisions. The world is aware that we have these racial divisions, that we have these cultural divisions, and one of the things that these Russian infiltrators did in regard to social media was they set up accounts. They didn't just set up accounts that that pandered to white supremacists. They set up accounts that pandered to black supremacists. They've set up accounts that pandered to conservatives and liberals and whatnot. And then they basically just stirred the pot and fueled these divisions between all of us. in order to basically polarize us that much more and prime the pump for individuals to support the stochastic terrorism that was coming out of Trump's mouth. The birtherism movement and whatnot, that was completely racist. There was nothing. There's no way you can say that wasn't racist.
Right, and then he gets in office and calls a lot of our allies and friends shithole countries. And the only reason he uses language like infest, he uses language about rats. Yep. He uses language about, there's other terms that he uses that are he only aims at districts or countries that are majority minority. Because if you look at the crime rates in some all white districts in Appalachia, they have crime statistics that are much worse than Baltimore. But you don't hear him talking about those communities. You hear him talking about the district represented by Representative Cummings. And then he talks about shithole countries in Africa. That hurts our national security.
Yeah.
And he pulls back aid to those countries.
Yep.
We're not even you don't hear him worried about or doing anything about the current Ebola crisis in the Congo. That is a national security threat. And we are actually safer when we send aid and medical, and particularly medical, to other countries. Those countries become more stable and therefore less of a threat to us. He doesn't care about that. And it forces that back him don't care about that as long as they're able to put their marker down in the racial chess game. And I think it's really a problem.
And to piggyback off that comment, same thing in regard to what's going on at our southern border, the southern border crisis. There is a strong current of racism in regard to how individuals are being treated down there. But the national security, there are a couple of national security issues with that. The first is the health crisis that's being created by all of these individuals who are being packed into this small area, and then you have them being watched by, correctional officers, guards, and whatnot. And now, from what I understand, the military is supposed to be, involved in supervising. They're not supposed to be touching or interacting with the individuals who are being detained, but they're supposed to be guarding. I don't understand what that is. I feel like they're just dipping their toes into violating the what I think it's the Comitatus law or whatever, Lee. But yeah, so these individuals are watching these migrants who are there, who could have an illness, who could have because sickness basically spreads a lot faster whenever you have unsanitary conditions. That's a given. So you have somebody who comes in with some virus, with some illness or whatever, that spreads like wildfire, that ends up going to whoever is working there, because it's not going to say, I just want to get, these migrants sick. I want to get, whoever is within, the zone that this virus can go to. Then these individuals can take it home and give it to their families. So you have operations or situations that place us all in jeopardy whenever we're talking about healthcare, when we're talking about detaining migrants. And on top of that too, the second thing that I feel is a point of national security is we're bringing these individuals into this country and we're treating them in such a fashion that they are not going to forget for the rest of their lives. If I come in as a 5-year-old, I'm stripped away from my mom and my dad, I'm put into some home in North Carolina, like the facility that you posted the other day, Lee, where basically I can be sexually abused, I could be neglected, whatever. I grow up in that system, and I'm totally aware of who did this to me. I'm totally aware of the fact that I don't have my mother or my father anymore because America didn't do anything. Not just Trump, because the fact is Trump isn't down there putting people into overcrowded conditions. Trump isn't taking parents away from their children. We have people who are complicit in regard to doing this. And so I grow up in this environment knowing all these people, who are part of this experience that I had. That's going to engender some feelings of animosity in me. And we're just basically hoping that everybody down the line is going to be like, oh, no harm, no foul, 2019 to 2016 to 2020, those are just some crazy times. We're all fine now. We're sorry about what happened to you. No, there will be some individuals who will be wanting just desserts, who will be wanting to come back at our country. That's what I feel is going to be an issue.
Laura, you had an event last week or 2 weeks ago where people of authority were involved in attacks on members of the Latino community that I think is just absolutely one of the worst things I've ever heard. And I'm very proud of you for calling that out. I don't know if everybody knows about that.
I was just perusing Facebook one day and then found myself involved in a conversation with a firefighter who said that he thought that we should exterminate all of the detained immigrants. And going along with what Lee said earlier, somebody out there is looking for some encouragement. And that comment could have given somebody some encouragement to commit a heinous genocidal act. And that's what it just hit me so hard, was that I didn't personally think that guy would go do anything. But is there people out there that are looking for the encouragement? And yes. And I think that he could have easily reached them with that rhetoric. And he doesn't need to be in public service.
We've already seen these so-called militia groups patrolling the border area, armed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We got a comment. Sarah Wild said, many of these attacks are perpetrated by white men. Do we ever discuss why this might be? Are there things we are doing or not doing in society to contribute to the development of their detrimental beliefs and choices? Not to mention our clear inability to stop them. Well, I'm going to fill that out to you guys.
Oh, boy. Like I said, we tend to identify, clearly there's a risk internationally of terror coming from countries that we are currently involved in hostilities with. That is actually true, and we pay a lot of attention to that. But I think Sarah is correct that the domestic attacks don't really come from that source, with the huge exception, of course, of 9/11 and I think the Pulse attacks. The rest of the big ones have been committed by, well, there was the one in California as well. But other than that, a lot of these attacks are committed by guys that look like me or look like Lee. And I don't know how we stop that other than to really speak out against the type of rhetoric that empowers folks like that. If you start looking for the reason why it happens, you're not going to find it. But
True.
I think with social media, and the FBI report that I referenced earlier says that they are behind. Social media allows the ideas to spread faster, quicker, and without any counter voice. And so you get people in their own little bubble, and they all talk about QAnon, or they all talk about, the pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. that's involved in the child sex ring, which didn't happen. And a 28-year-old guy from Statesville shows up with an assault rifle to rescue the children, because nobody is in those areas to speak up and say, this is crazy. So I guess it's really incumbent upon us to really speak up.
The warning signs are there, and these groups, these domestic groups, operate exactly the same way that international, foreign terrorist groups operate. They have recruitment tools. We've run into that in a local group here that's widely believed to be used as a radicalization cell, normalizing hate and white supremacy views, and it puts people in contact with other people. Now it's not, we're going to meet at the local bar. It's, we've got anonymous ways we can meet and hide our footprint to make it harder to track. But it's kind of, I watched an older movie recently, Minority Report, and the guy rolls the ball across the desk, and the guy catches it before it hits the floor, and he asked him why he called it. And he said to keep it from hitting the floor. And he followed that up with, how do you know it was going to hit the floor if you didn't catch it? So it's like going back to terrorism. Are these guys radicalized because there's some evil inherent in their country or their belief system, or are they radicalized because we're there? Or have we not had a major terror attack since 9/11 because we're there? Or is there another reason? You know, it's a lot of going back and forth that we really, you know, can't answer. I can say that if we weren't invading other countries because we can, and no one in the world is going to stop us and stand up to us as a loud enough group to make a difference, we wouldn't have to deal with so many international terrorists. They wouldn't be fleeing their countries into Europe because their countries are destroyed if we weren't there destroying them. That's not to say that,
particularly the white supremacist terror is not something that's new. Let's be clear.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been in our country for a very, very long time, since the very beginning. Let's be honest about this. And those guys were wearing white hoods and raiding small towns in North Carolina and Mississippi and Illinois in the 1920s. Now they're online and they are shooting up, you know, shopping malls. It's not new, but it certainly seems to be more, more rapid than it has been before. And that's I agree with Sarah. That's a clear issue, and I don't know how you. I don't know how we get to those guys. We need to make sure that the younger ones don't get caught up in it, or you end up with Charleston.
And that's the thing too. I mean, you struck on a point that I really think needs to be addressed, and that's the stochastic terrorism that is indicative of this administration. The fact that we are normalizing a kind of rhetoric that is very, very, very old in regard to this country, and one could even say it's within the founding of this country in regard to how the occupants that were here prior were regarded as savages, while the people who came were pilgrims. They were settlers. You know, they tamed the land, and so it's rooted in the very, very nature of how we separate ourselves in this society. Race is something that we have used, and it's an artificial construct. It's not something whenever you're born, you don't come out with, you know, a card that says, you know, this is a white child, this is a Hispanic child, this is a black child, or whatever. We all have bought into this construct, and we say, okay, this is the team you're going to be on today. You're going to be a black guy. This is what you're going to go through. This is what you're going to have to deal with as a black guy. Defend your team, you know, off to the races. And so when it comes to how we interact with one another in this society, a lot of the pressure, a lot of the anxiety that's being expressed, this whole, you know, we got to take our country back mentality is rooted in that. My team is losing. There's not enough people on my team. Or more people from this other team come in here and they start playing, then I'm never going to have, you know, any more advantages for my team. So we got to do whatever we can, you know, whether it's lie, cheat, steal, you know, drive a car into people in Charlottesville or whatever. We've got to defend the team. And this is where I think we have the most difficulty as a society. It's talking about this team-based mentality that is a fundamental aspect of being an American in this country. You're supposed to be proud of your team. And if someone criticizes you for being, for you know, not for advancing your team, then that person, you know, is a racist, or that person that, you know, is someone that you can't trust. And you shouldn't work with them or whatever because they're keeping your team from winning.
I don't disagree with you at all. I think a lot of these guys are brought up in a world, or were brought up in a world, and sort of receive the message that men, particularly white men, are supposed to be in charge and have the advantage. And therefore, when they get to be 18, 20, 25 years old, or 50, and are not the advantaged person they thought they were supposed to be, or had the natural right to be, that's when they get angry. That's when they start looking for somebody to blame. And that's when there's others around them to sort of contribute to that. And that's when these small groups that Lee's talking about can start to turn and weaponize them. And to go back to an earlier point Lee had, Goebbels didn't break windows.
True.
Goebbels put the message out on the radio and in the posters on the streets that led other people to break windows. And that is what scares me. The language has always been out there. I have never seen a president use it.
True.
With some exceptions, there have been racially charged campaigns. Let's be real.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan started his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi for a reason. But you never saw him talking about vermin infesting Baltimore and clearly meaning not the rats, but the voters. And I think that's a sea change, a very dangerous one. And I'm worried about where it goes.
And I think that another concern for me is the minimization of that threat. There's a lot of people who basically state that, we've had racist presidents before. We had Nixon. Nixon was racist as hell. And then, what about all of the presidents, around the time of slavery? We had racism back then. But the fact is, during those periods of time, the racism was relative. Their racism was relative to the time period. Not saying it was right, but it was at least relative to the time period. And so as people advanced in regard to recognizing individuals as more than 3/5 of a human being, as women were recognized as individuals that deserved the right to vote, as, people who were gay were recognized as individuals who should be allowed to get married, we were able to move forward as a society collectively and say, this is where we are now. But this is the first time where we've had a president who has said, I don't give a damn where we are right now. I'm taking us back to a time that I prefer, that it gives my team an advantage.
Yep. I agree.
So
Lee,
we're seeing some we're seeing some division, intentional division, I believe, in the Democrat Party amongst voters on traditional lines of division, if you will. I've seen a lot of people, trying to imply basically that Bernie Sanders has a weak history on black rights, which is absurd because he doesn't endorse checks as a form of reparation. He says that we can't address this without a fundamental change in the system of institutionalized racism, which is something I agree heavily on. But people are saying, this candidate in the primary is for reparations, so they must care more about the Black Americans. And it's being white. Like I feel like I have to kind of tread lightly. But it's like, you want to scream, like, can you not see this intentional divide?
I agree.
To try and they know they can't just put one candidate in the chute and hope they can distract us long enough to force them through. So they've got enough candidates to muddy the field to make it plausible that their candidate made it through to the end in the primary. And bottom line, the status quo, business as usual, benefits corporate Democrats and the DNC, and they're willing to give Trump and the GOP 4 more years to keep that corporate money flowing.
And that's my concern too in regard to
I'm a
identity
traditional
politics.
Democrat. I'm not. I promise you that.
Go ahead, John. No one's labeling you, John. You can.
I'll label myself on that one, but there's no way that I'm willing to trade that. I'm not, just to get sidetrack a little bit. I'm no Bernie voter, but if he wins, I'll knock doors till my knuckles fall off.
Gotcha.
We can't let this guy stay in the office.
That's not to say that all Democrats are of that same mind. This is the so-called men behind the curtain that are controlling the threads of power, so to say.
And I agree with you. I believe that there are individuals on the left who are perpetuating these divisions, and I believe there's people on the right who are perpetuating these divisions because these divisions have made money. There's a lot of money in promoting blackness. There's a lot of money in promoting whiteness. There are people who have built their whole careers off of being, I'm the black candidate, I'm the black, the person who's going to protect the black community. And we're seeing that on the right now. We have individuals who are in government who are basically saying outright what's his face in the Senate, who was basically admonished for making racist statements. Can't remember his name right now. And there were bold ones too, but you have individuals who are basically saying, there's nothing wrong with being white. There's nothing wrong with celebrating your whiteness, when in all actuality, because these are false constructs, being black, being white. How do you orient yourself around that? I mean, even talking about reparations being this big thing now.
I don't think, and I'll ask you this, Joe, as a question, because it's more important that I ask than speak. But
Gotcha.
Do you think that addressing the issues and talking about the issues is the same as perpetuating them?
No, I don't think. I don't think that addressing the issues and talking about the issues is the same as perpetuating. As a matter of fact, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions and one of the biggest traps that's used to prevent individuals from talking about the issues. We've gotten to a point in society where if we even say something about race, suddenly you're a racist. No,
you're playing the race card, right?
Exactly. Yeah. You're playing the race card, and that's supposed to shut down all discussion. If I say anything about being black, or if we mention anything about someone being white, and that's one of the gatekeeping mechanisms of supremacy in this country, is to make it uncomfortable to even discuss these issues. Yeah. And so if you make it so uncomfortable that people won't even talk about it, then there's no way we're going to address any inequities that rise from it. We're all supposed to adhere to it. Well, like I said, when you come out of your mother, you're given a title. You're given a label. You're going to be a white guy. You're going to be a black guy. Now, don't talk about it for the rest of your life. What the fuck? I don't understand that. How is that supposed to work? So then, whenever you have inequity, because that's what, race was an invention. We can admit that. We can talk about, biological differences in regard to different human beings around the globe. But race as a construct was an invention. And so whenever we talk about this invention, every invention has a purpose. Every invention has a goal. We invented the wheel so we could, ride on that. We can use it to push wheelbarrows. We can use it to drive on it. We invented the phone so we could talk to one another. We invented the internet so we could exchange information. We don't ever talk about why race was invented. And one of the main reasons why race was invented was to point out and justify this hierarchy in regard to society, this hierarchy in regard to how we interact with others around the globe. Obviously, the individuals who invented it placed themselves at the top of the hierarchy, and then basically everybody else was given another level and a different ranking assigned to that level. And it was fine as long as, the savages were over here in the darkness of Africa, and these individuals who were cultured were over in Asia or in Europe or whatever. It was fine whenever everybody was separate. But then whenever we all came together, when I say fine, I don't mean fine like I agree with the concept, but it was fine in regard to how we interacted with one another. But then when everybody was brought together in this melting pot, and whenever individuals populated the planet and started moving around thanks to cars and trains and all other sorts of transportation devices, and people wanted to resettle and move to different locations, then those labels start to come up. Then we start to have an issue in regard to, you can't live here because you are a savage, and as a savage, you should not be, among us. That's just my take on how things unfolded.
That's still prevalent. What we deal with, running into people occasionally who will use the.
You muted yourself, Lee.
You muted yourself, Lee. Can you hear us? Okay, you said you running into people that what?
You're black and you're supposed to be under the.
He muted again.
I think he's got it on pressing his space bar. Okay. There you are, Lee.
You said you're black. Okay. You said you're black and you're supposed to be. Well, go ahead. Start that statement over again.
Sorry, my wife keeps trying to break in on me. Didn't realize it was muting my mic. To reiterate, there's a huge and specific difference between people enslaving other people for whatever reason that's been going on still to this day and back into antiquity, and white people specifically going and saying black people are supposed to be subservient to us because of the natural God-given order of things.
Yeah. And I think this is something that we don't often talk about that as well, as far as, there being a spiritual component to how we look at other individuals, how we treat other individuals, that there is a hierarchy that's somehow sanctioned. And it's the same thing in fascism. It's the same thing in regard to what happened in Uganda. It's the same thing that's what that happened in Kosovo. There's this belief, the same thing that happened in regard to America during not just slavery, but in regard to how it was settled. Manifest destiny. It was the right of those settlers to expand as far as they can and do whatever they needed to do it and to tame the land, because of the fact that God gave them this country. God gave them this edict that they were supposed to go off and conquer. Same thing in regard to the Crusades. God said that we need to spread his word as far and wide as we possibly can, based upon the need by the Creator for us to bring civilization to these savages. What we're doing is right because God's on our side, but these other individuals, I don't know what their God is, but their God is definitely inferior to who we're worshiping.
And that's I think you hit on a good point there. To me, at least, that's a consistency between the white supremacist terrorist and the Islamicist terrorist. Is
Exactly.
They think that they're doing the right thing, when in fact their ideology has poisoned them to the point that they're doing horrible things and believing they're right. And I don't want to excuse them at all and give them the excuse of thinking they're doing the right thing, because they're clearly not. But it's that sort of closed group mentality. And Laura, I think, to go back to something that your friend posted under the thread, they're all men. There's a big issue here, I think, of I don't know what you call it, but male fragility, at least on the white supremacist terror and the 3%ers and these guys who want to prove their manhood by they know how to use their weapons better than everybody else. And I think we've got a problem in this country in particular, and maybe some other countries, of our definition of what a man is kind of sick.
Yeah.
And being that Laura is the only person here who's not a man, I'd like to see what she thinks about that. Put her on the spot.
What I think about a definition of a man.
No, about that, the context of
the concept of toxic. He's talking about the
this.
concept of toxic masculinity, or basically how masculinity operates in our society.
I've said for a while that white males are the problem, but the problem with me saying that is I'm usually saying it to a fragile white male, and they take it about as well as I anticipate that they take it, and it's they look like who I'm saying is a terrorist, and they cannot comprehend the fact that they look like the 2019 American terrorists, and they just can't process it. And it's a lot harder to even recognize these guys because they're already in this country, and they look like the majority of people here. And so that's why we have a problem identifying, who is the threat. Oh,
I got you.
You
You're
guys
back.
still got me? Sorry.
You're back.
But yeah, the most fragile people that I've encountered through conversations with strangers on the internet has been the American white male.
And I think
but it's nice to see there's some that aren't.
And I think that's tied into what we were talking about in regard to what how we perceive individuals in this country, and there's a sense of entitlement that, you know, because this country was conquered by individuals who looked a specific way, because those individuals had power in this country and they looked a specific way, you know, there is the future of this country is somehow a birthright for those individuals who look that specific way. And so, you know, to even state that, you know, if you look that way, you might be a terrorist, is absurd to many, because it's like, no, this is my country. You know, I'm defending my country. I'm standing up for, you know, the land that my forefathers settled. I'm protecting, you know, what's mine, and trying to make things great again the way they were, versus, you know, I'm hurting individuals who are also Americans. There's this idea that some people are more American than other Americans, which is why we get the "send her back" comment, which is why we get the, you know, "go back to your country" comment or whatever, even though everybody who is here who is not Native American came over.
Right. I think that a lot of people, when they hear the word terrorist, they think that it can only be a foreign entity. And that's not the case at all. I mean, we clearly, domestic terrorism is the major threat, but a lot of people, I think, when they hear terrorists, it's something foreign to them. And so that's when you tell them that, well, you look like the, you know, prototype for a terrorist here in this country now. But it's absurd to them, like you said, because they think that it's a foreign entity and it's not something that can happen on U.S. soil, when in fact that is what's happening on U.S. soil.
Yep.
True.
I believe if you want a really good read, Lies My Teacher Told Me, can't remember the author name right off, but basically American history and Western history from high school down to grade school is taught very much a white male Eurocentric version of history. And I think we could probably see some correlation with these white male radicals and extremists when they come of age and leave the public school world and realize the world isn't the way they thought it was. They have no coping mechanism, and they're very vulnerable to, I mean, they've just had their worldview completely upended, and their fragile masculinity is not prepared to deal with it.
I think that's a good point.
Oh, good. Well, we're at the 8:05 mark. I know we started a little bit later, but what I want to do, if we ideally can do this, because Cash wasn't able to be with us tonight. I hadn't talked to him about being here. I know you know Cash too, John, but I really think that it would be great to have Cash on here to contribute some of his perspective. So I think we should have a part 2 to this discussion, if we can, next Thursday, if you're available. If not, you know, we can do something else next Thursday, and then, like, you know, whenever you are available again, I'll make sure the sound is right and everything, and we'll get going. But yeah, I mean, it was really great to have this discussion with all you guys tonight, and I want to do it again.
That sounds great.
Okay.
As long as Laura's not going to be on.
Laura's got to be gone. She has the flavor. All right, y'all.